Rishi Sunak appears to be backtracking on his government's climate commitments as he unveiled an expansion of North Sea oil and gas drilling. Around 100 new licences will be given out, but campaigners have accused him of taking a wrecking ball to the UK's climate targets. Speaking earlier, the Prime Minister defended the decision.
Today, we're committing to future licensing rounds in the North Sea. And at the same time, we're investing in a whole new British industry to capture and store carbon, with 2 new sites in the Humber and North East Scotland. Those alone expect to support up to 25,000 jobs and generate more than £10 billion of new investment. That's how this government will meet net zero by 2050, driving down energy prices, cutting emissions and reducing our dependence on foreign oil and gas.
If your mind boggles, have no fear, because joining me now is talkTV's political editor, Kate McCann. Good to have you here, Kate. Yeah. And Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. With both of those experts in tow, we might be able to at least attempt to make head nor tail of this mishmash of a story. So if you look at the front page of the Times, PM gives green light for more North Sea drilling. If you look at the Sun, PM vows to end anti-car moves. Fed up drivers want more change. Now get a move on Rishi. If you look at the Guardian, ministers seek curbs on 20-mile-an-hour limits in push to woo motorists. And somehow Rishi Sunak maintains that this is all for the good of the environment and the good of the planet. And he's not rowing back on any commitments at all, really. This is the only way. Extra drilling in the North Sea is the way forward and makes ecological sense. Let's start with Kate and see if she can begin to unravel this tangled web, because it is a tangled web, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there is a lot to unpack here.
There is.
The reality is, if you are surprised to suddenly start hearing more about cars and about oil and gas and about road schemes and low traffic neighbourhoods, then maybe you might want to have a look back at what happened in the Uxbridge by-election.
That's what we want to do. We most want to look back at the Uxbridge by-election. We know what happened, don't we?
We do know what happened, but I think that's probably a good jumping off point for what's happening now.
Okay.
Because for the Conservatives, they maybe didn't expect to hold on to that seat, and they did by the skin of their teeth. The point is that by-election proved that there are some areas of policy which are more important to people than what's currently happening in central government in Westminster, with all of the normal caveats that by-elections are very unusual. And I think what it's done is it's given the Conservatives a jumping-off point, if you like, of a point of difference between them and the Labour Party.
OK, let's just remind people what happened in Uxbridge, in case their eyes weren't glued upon it. They've already forgotten what happened, just living their lives, trying to make a living. Yeah. They may not remember. This is Boris Johnson's old constituency. Tell everybody what happened and why, because it was an unexpected result.
It was a Conservative-held seat. It's in the outer part of London, so Greater London. And what happened is a small a local issue became the defining issue, and that was the extension of the ULEZ charge. So the scheme which is introduced by the Mayor of London to remove polluting vehicles, or people have to pay in order to drive them on the roads, £12.50 charge. Now that scheme, the court has just given the go-ahead for the Mayor to push it out into Greater London, but it's very controversial because lots of people who drive vehicles which are more polluting would have to pay this £12.50 charge. So that by-election was then fought on this particular issue, the Conservatives saying it wasn't on and Labour saying, well, kind of a bit of a mishmash between it needs to be done more slowly and we have to do it because of the air quality in London. And because of the fact that the Conservatives won this seat, it's been used as a kind of example of where Labour and Tories can show that they are very different. And I think that's partly why we're starting to see from the government conversations around, we're going to review low traffic neighbourhoods, so we're going to have a review of this policy, see if we need to stop them, because lots of people don't like those. And this idea that, should the government rethink some of its targets on 2030 for cars, 2050 for net zero, and today the idea of more oil and gas. Now, on the face of it, you can kind of see why the government might be pushing some of these things. But I think the reality of this is much more complicated, particularly when you're talking about green targets, because drilling more oil and gas in this country does have an effect on emissions. They may not add towards the UK's own emissions targets, but in terms of the global emissions, they do count. And there's actually a really complex picture going on beneath the surface here. There's also a complicating factor about how much of that oil and gas will end up going into UK homes. And the answer is not all of it. We export a huge amount of what we produce in the UK. So it's a complicated picture, I think.
And yet, Rishi Sunak is arguing that it's all to the good. He's not saying, now, look, what I'm going to do is I'm not necessarily going to fulfill all our greener pledges because, you know, we need this and we need that. And therefore, we're going to have to kind of compromise and not quite deliver what we said we would because maybe we've slightly oversold it or overstated it, or even maybe it won't be very popular in the next election. Actually, these green issues aren't going over as big as we thought they would. So I tell you what we're doing, we're going to kind of move back. He's not saying that. He's somehow arguing that this is for the good of the planet.
Yeah.
How is he doing that? How's he spinning
Well,
this
because
bit?
so the government isn't shying away from some of those targets. So no new petrol diesel cars by 2030, for example. They are saying that sticks. So it was a bit of a wobble last week, but they're quite firm now that target will stay in place. Now, part of the reason for that is because the UK has just seen lots of inward investment in terms of battery factories. Now, if you start saying, well, that 2030 target doesn't count anymore, that investment in battery factories starts to look a little bit shaky. So, you know, it's quite a fine line for the Prime Minister to walk because voters generally do support green policies. They just don't want to have to pay for them. So what the Conservative government is trying to do,
big deal, isn't
but that's what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do here with this messaging is say to people, we're going to keep the green targets, but you're not going to have to pay more. And you're not going to have to pay more because we're going to produce more oil and gas in the UK, so we won't have to pay as much for that particular resource. And you won't have to pay as much for your cars because this, that and the other. That's what they're trying to do. The question is whether that's realistic. And when you speak to people inside the industry, particularly on extracting oil and gas, actually the picture is much more complicated when it comes to emissions. And yes, today there is the introduction of a carbon capture scheme alongside it, which is going to be huge for the future of trying to reduce our emissions in this country, but it is not the entire answer. None of this is the whole answer, actually.
Let's bring in Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Sir John, can you explain this? What is Rishi Sunak trying to do here? I mean, I'd like to say something about coals to Newcastle, but it doesn't quite fit. And anyway, I'm not sure about fossil fuels. You'll explain what's going on.
Well, I think, to be honest, I mean, Kate's narrative was brilliant, a brilliant exposition. But I'm not sure we should look at either of today's two decisions within the narrow frame of what happened in a by-election a couple of weeks ago. The honest truth is that we've been expecting for quite some considerable time for the UK government to decide that it wanted to grant more licenses to explore for the possibility of oil and gas inside the North Sea. This is not new. Meanwhile, when it comes to carbon capture and storage, well, the government first thought about pursuing this in 2015. Actually, Alex Salmond, when he was First Minister of Scotland and campaigning for independence, he was talking about it before the 2014 referendum. The government we thought the government was going to come out in favour of this a couple of years ago, and then they decided to give it somewhere else. We're now finally, perhaps, doing something about it, but it's long been recognised or been hoped that at least part of the answer towards getting towards net zero was indeed carbon capture, because at the end of the day, we're not going to stop all burning of fossil fuels. We're not going to stop all industrial processes that result in the generation of carbon dioxide, including not least, of course, farming. And that therefore we need to find some way of taking it that does come out, going into the atmosphere. So to that extent, at least, we shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which this is a short-term decision. I think the other thing one needs to say about the narrative is this: it was a local issue about the extension of a particular charge that for about 1 in 10 people living in the constituency would have had a particular effect. There isn't any evidence in the national opinion polls that the government's focus on this issue since the Uxbridge by-election has resulted in any narrowing of Labour's lead over the Conservatives in the polls at all. Labour are in fact still 19, 20 points ahead. That's about as bad as it has been for Rishi Sunak. And I think, therefore, we shouldn't exaggerate how much mileage there is more broadly for the government. Indeed, YouGov put out some polling out today asking people whether or not we should continue to exploit gas and oil in the North Sea. Now, and frankly, public opinion was quite pretty much divided, but there were slightly more people saying we shouldn't than saying we should. And there's still many a Conservative supporter who are of that view. So I don't think we should be wary, and I think the Conservatives should be wary from their ability to exploit a particular local issue in the context of a by-election to thinking this is necessarily going to be the thing that's going to deliver the Conservatives' victory against the backdrop of an economy that is still struggling, a party which, again, Ipsos data out today, people are deeply sceptical and critical about the way in which the government is running the economy, and of course against public services where, frankly, a challenge facing both parties is how we're possibly going to improve them against a very, very substantial fiscal constraint.
Kate?
Yeah, I think everything Sir John says is right. I think the question is whether, when you're looking ahead to a general election, which I think the Conservative government is doing right now, the Prime Minister is trying to think about that. One of the things that they are really focused on is what is the point of difference? How do we prove that we are different to what Labour is offering? How do we differentiate ourselves? And I think what they have found, or what they believe they've found in this issue, is a way to do that, is a way to say, well, we are not Labour, because Labour have said, no more drilling in the North Sea, that they've said no more new oil and gas licences. And I think, whether or not it will be successful is for the longer term. But what the government is going to try and do is exploit that as a point of difference, and one that they believe will be popular with voters if they can try and link these two things together. Now, what I'm saying is I don't think they do necessarily link together. I don't think they do necessarily follow. But I think that's what they're going to try and do, is set that narrative in motion if they can.
Let's bring Sir John in on this one. So, Sir John, the Telegraph, particularly over the weekend, front page, huge story, big interview with Rishi Sunak inside the paper, but big front page story. Rishi Sunak says, I am friend to the motorist. Now, I don't know if you're a motorist. I don't know if Kate is. I certainly take public transport a lot of the time, but I'm a motorist. And when I saw that phrase, friend to the motorist, I'm going to say which emotions, but all manner of emotions ignited within my soul, because I believe I have a soul. If I look deeply within, I do still have one after all these years. I think I do at any rate. But when it said friend to the motorist, I thought, oh my God, because nobody ever says that anymore. Nobody ever claims to be a friend to the motorist. Motorists feel in every way excommunicated, defenestrated, reviled, and everything else. So to see the Prime Minister saying, I am a friend to the motorist, definitely ignited a response in me. If it did so in me, I should imagine it did so in many other people. Some, of course, would have been enormously hostile to it and hated it on sight, thought what a reprehensible and revolting thing it is to say you're a friend to the motorist, we should all be on a bicycle. However, it must be doing something. So Sir John, for Rishi Sunak to be a self-proclaimed friend of the motorist in big letters all over the Telegraph, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, let me make two observations. I think one might want to argue that what's going on is part of what I think has been an identity crisis for the Conservative Party really ever since the pandemic. The legacy of the pandemic has been that the Conservative Party is presiding over record levels of taxation and record levels of public spending. It was a concern about that that led to Liz Truss's victory in the leadership contest. And of course, this is what we expect Labour to do. We expect Labour to do that. And I think the Conservative Party, therefore, is desperate to indeed, as you point out, to try and say, look, we are different. We are not a party that's pursuing centre-left policies, even though in many respects that's been the reality that's been forced upon it. So that's observation number one. Observation number two, of course, it is fascinating to see that indeed the Labour Party are indeed approaching the next general election, in a sense, trying to minimise the points of differences between it and the Conservative Party. It's chasing the centre ground of politics, which many strategists argue is where you should be, whereas the Conservative Party seems to be pursuing the next election by trying to see if it can indeed identify clear blue water between itself and Labour. Now, I think we could have an interesting debate about which is the more effective strategy. I think one possible lesson from Uxbridge for Labour is that it did prove to be remarkably easy to divert at least a section of its potential support on the basis of the local ULEZ issue, which does raise questions about how strong is the commitment of many of those people who say they're going to vote Labour in a general election, even though Labour's lead is as strong as it is. But we are seeing very divergent approaches to the general election, and we'll wait to see which wins. But of course, just have to remember at the end of the day, for all the positioning in which the Conservative Party might want to engage, what at the end of the day it is hanging around its neck is the perception amongst voters is that the economy has tanked and that the government is responsible for that. In other words, the problem the Conservative Party faces is not a question of positioning, It's a question of perceived competence.
So, John, thank you. Kate, thanks very much indeed.